Your hand, Judy, just so you know, your hand is covering the screen. Yeah.
Oh, I thought I had my video off.
I'm going to go close my door for sound. All right, welcome everybody. There are more people coming in, so we may wait one more minute, but as my teacher, Judy Callahan says, the clock on the clubhouse wall says 10:30, so we're going to get started very, very shortly, and I want to praise you all for your punctuality, but I know that there are many more people who signed up than are here right now, so let's wait one more minute. Is that okay with you, Judy? All right, just a few more seconds. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still coming in. However, this is being recorded, and God willing, we'll post it in a dignified and accessible place. Bruchim habaim, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful presentation we have for you today here at Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center, or PJTC for short. We have this presentation with our guest, Dr. Dov Waxman. I'll say more about him in a moment, but I just want to thank the Adult Education Committee and the Social Justice Committee, these committees here at PJTC, two very active committees who are helping us with this, who are sponsoring and helping us with this presentation today. And we'll say more about additional sponsors after the talk. But I want to thank our social justice folks who are here and here in spirit, and our adult education folks as well. And now I want to introduce to you our guest today, Dr. Dov Waxman. Dov Waxman is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, good old UCLA, where he holds the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies. He is also the director of UCLA's Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. And before joining UCLA, he was the Stotsky Professor of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies at Northeastern University and the director of Northeastern University's Middle East Center. An award-winning teacher, he has also been professor at City University of New York and Bowdoin College. He has had visiting fellowships at Oxford University, Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan University, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He received his PhD and MA degrees from Johns Hopkins University, go Blue Jays, and his BA from Oxford University. His research focuses on the conflict over Israel and Palestine, Israeli politics, and foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewish relationship with Israel, Jewish politics, and Contemporary Anti-Semitism. He is the author of dozens of scholarly articles and 4 books, including The Pursuit of Peace and the Crisis of Israeli Identity, Defending and Defining the Nation, also Israel's Palestinians, The Conflict Within, Trouble in the Tribe, The American-Jewish Conflict over Israel, and most recently, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. He has also been published in the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Atlantic Monthly, Salon, Foreign Policy, The Forward, and Haaretz. He is a frequent commentator on television and radio. We are so grateful to have him here with us today. And just to give everybody a little bit of taste of the format, our esteemed guest, Dr. Waxman, is going to give a talk, which I believe he said he's debuting here today. So it's like at the LA Phil when they have a new conductor. It feels really wonderful to be honored that way here. And then what's going to happen is we're going to have a moderated Q&A after the talk. And so we're going to, so Dr. Waxman is going to have his talk. You are invited to submit any questions you have by chat. God willing, they are questions in the form of a question instead of comments in the form of a question. And feel free to put those questions in the chat throughout the talk, and then we will collate and curate the questions following the talk for a wonderful and lively back and forth and Q&A. And let me make sure that our speaker is unmuted. That will be most productive. And so without further ado, just thanking Judy from the Adult Ed Committee, Peter from Social Justice helping us bring this together. I want to hand the microphone over to Dr. Dov Waxman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Carrier, and I also want to thank Peter Braun and Judy Callahan and the Adult Education and Social Justice Committees for inviting me to speak today and organizing this talk. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us on this lovely Sunday morning. I'm sure there are other things you could be doing with your time, and I'm particularly grateful for you to be joining us today because unfortunately what I'm going to tell you won't make for happy listening. I'm going to give you that warning at the outset, so you're forewarned. If you want to be uplifted and hear a lot of positivity, now's your chance to leave. But if you want to learn about the serious challenges to Israeli democracy, please stay. Because in my talk today, I'm going to focus on 2 of these challenges in particular. The government's attempted judicial overhaul. I'm going to spend some time talking about that, but I also want to talk at the end of my lecture about the one-state reality that exists between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So let me begin, first of all, by talking about this judicial overhaul. As I'm sure you're all well aware, for the past few months now, Israelis have been engaged in a battle unlike any that they had previously fought. While generals and soldiers have been very actively involved in this battle, it has not been a violent battle. It's been waged peacefully by hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians. And it has not been a battle fought against Israel's enemies, but against Israel's very own government, the most far-right governing coalition in Israeli history. The reason for this battle, of course, is this attempted judicial overhaul. This overhaul has been widely understood, correctly in my opinion, to be a serious threat to Israeli democracy. And I think it's important to explain just why that is. And in order to recognize and understand why it is a serious threat to Israeli democracy, we really need to have a look at the specifics of what this judicial overhaul, if enacted, would entail. I want to focus in particular on 2 elements. First of all, is the issue of judicial review, what's called judicial review. Currently, the Israeli Supreme Court has the power to strike down legislation if it contradicts one of Israel's basic laws. So, for example, if the government were to pass, say, a law that hurts the rights of women in Israel, the Supreme Court, in its capacity as the High Court of Justice, could strike down that law because it contradicts Israel's basic law on human dignity and liberty. Now, should note that this power is one that the Supreme Court only really took on in since the 1990s. under the leadership of then Chief Justice Aharon Barak. It was not a power that the Supreme Court has always exercised, just really since the 1990s. And it's a power that has increasingly been the object of criticism by the Israeli right, who have argued that who really oppose what they see as the Supreme Court's judicial activism, and particularly its liberal activism. The legislation that the government is proposing would essentially limit the Supreme Court's ability to veto legislation, limiting its ability, in other words, to do this judicial review. One way it would limit this is by requiring a unanimous decision of all 15 judges on the Supreme Court to veto legislation. Currently, that's not the case. And also, even in many ways, more importantly, it would allow the smallest possible majority in Israel's Knesset, in Israel's parliament, just 61 out of 120 Knesset members, to override the court if it does, in fact, veto law. It would also, the government also intends to make basic laws immune from judicial review. And so what this would mean is essentially that any law that, again, a simple majority of lawmakers defines as a basic law would essentially be immune from judicial review. So in other words, if the government were to pass a law, say, discriminating against minorities in Israel and label that a basic law, the Supreme Court then would have no power to intervene. Okay, so that's on the issue of judicial review. The other important element of this judicial overhaul concerns the judicial appointment process. That is the appointments to both the Supreme Court and also to Israeli courts in general. In the current system, Israeli judges are appointed by a committee that includes an equal representation of politicians, sitting judges, and lawyers from the Bar Association. And this setup essentially requires everyone, the judges and politicians, to reach a consensus on the appointment of new justices to Israel's Supreme Court, as well as other civil courts. Now, the government's proposal would change the balance of power on that committee so that essentially the government would have an automatic majority on that committee and thereby enjoy complete control over the judicial appointments process. So those are, I think, the two most important elements in this judicial overhaul. Essentially, if it was enacted, it would give the government, as I said, essentially complete control over the appointment of new judges, make it almost impossible for the Supreme Court to invalidate new laws, and allow the Knesset to overrule such rulings in the rare cases that they're made. There's other elements as well. The government also wants to abolish the court's ability to review decisions by national or local authorities, by municipalities, on the basis of their so-called reasonability. And it also wants to allow ministers to pick their own legal advisors rather than have them appointed. So if you take all of these pieces together, you can see, I think, that this judicial overhaul would really weaken both the independence of the Israeli judiciary and the powers of the Israeli judiciary. And this would undermine Israeli democracy quite seriously, because the Supreme Court is really the only institution in Israel with the power to review government actions and legislation passed by the Knesset. It's important to recognize it is essentially the only institution that can serve as a check on the governing coalition in Israel and thereby protect the rights of Israelis. In other political systems, there are other kinds of checks and balances in place. But in the Israeli political system, there isn't a separation between the executive and the legislative branches of government, as there is, of course, in the United States, nor is there, say, a second parliamentary chamber, as there is, say, in the United Kingdom, which has a House of Lords, nor is there any real devolution of powers to local governments, as is the case, for example, in the United States' federal system. So there aren't other ways of really limiting or checking the power of the government outside of the Supreme Court. And so by weakening the Supreme Court in this manner, the proposed legislation would really essentially hand almost unlimited power to the ruling coalition government. And with this power, of course, the government could do what it wants. It could, for example, disqualify Arab political parties from running for parliament, which is something that has happened in the past, but has been vetoed in the past by the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court unable to exercise that veto. That is something that a future government could do. It could even deport Arab citizens of Israel, or at least encourage their emigration. It could also deport asylum seekers, particularly from Africa. It could curtail the activities of labor unions in Israel. It could restrict freedom of speech. And of course, for Palestinians in the West Bank, the Supreme Court is really the only institution to which they can turn to defend their rights. And so by weakening the Supreme Court, they would lose whatever reason, protection the Supreme Court has given them until now. So that is what the judicial overhaul entails. Now, it's worth noting what the argument put forward by the Israeli government, by the Netanyahu government is, and its supporters. They argue that the judicial overhaul, far from undermining Israeli democracy, would actually enhance Israeli democracy. And the reason why they make that argument is because essentially they regard the Supreme Court as both an elitist, and that is unrepresentative institution, which I think is a somewhat fair criticism. But they also regard it as an anti-democratic institution. And they take this view because essentially, as I've said in the past, the Supreme Court, using this power of judicial review, has sometimes voided legislation passed by the Israeli parliament. And from the government's perspective and its supporters, that essentially is blocking the will of the majority. And so as far as they see it, the Supreme Court, a panel of unelected judges, is essentially blocking the will of Israeli voters. Now, that view, I think, of the Supreme Court as an anti-democratic institution relies on a very narrow understanding, a very narrow conception of democracy as basically just majority rule. A majoritarian understanding of democracy. But democracy is not just majority rule. It also requires checks and balances to prevent the tyranny of the majority, to protect the rights of minorities and ensure equal rights for everyone within the state, and to safeguard the rule of law. Or at least this is what a liberal democracy entails. So in some sense, what the government prefers is a majoritarian democracy, or what's sometimes called a liberal democracy, along the lines of what Netanyahu's friend Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has created over the past decade. And in fact, I think it's not just Netanyahu who has this view, but really much of the Israeli right, I think, it's become an anathema to suggest that the power of the Jewish majority should be limited. There is a strong feeling, strong majoritarian sentiment, a strong belief that, you know, the majority, the Jewish majority in Israel, or at least within the Green Line, should not face restrictions on its wishes, on its power. And this idea, this majoritarian sentiment it's important to acknowledge, widely held by many Israeli Jews. Just to give you one data point, which I think is indicative of public attitudes, the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a non-partisan think tank in Israel, carries out a regular a survey of Israelis, of their attitudes towards democracy and democratic values. And the most recent democracy index, it's known as, from 2022, around half, nearly 49% of Israeli Jews think that Jewish citizens of Israel should have more rights than non-Jewish citizens of Israel. 49% believe that. Back in 2018, by contrast, just 27% agreed with that view. So you can see that there is this kind of growing majoritarian sentiment, or illiberal sentiment. And the government's judicial overhaul reflects that in many respects. Okay, so I talked a little bit about what's in this judicial overhaul and why I think it is a serious threat to Israeli democracy. But I want to now discuss what's driving this, what's behind this, what are the motives for it. Let's not forget that Prime Minister Netanyahu is Israel's longest serving prime minister. This is his 6th term in office. So one has to wonder, why now? Why has it taken Netanyahu until now to advance this judicial overhaul, if it is indeed such an important issue? Why has he waited so long to do it? Well, I think for Netanyahu, at least, the answer has to be his legal predicament. As we all know, since May of 2020, he has been on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And if he's convicted in this trial, which is ongoing, he could serve several years behind bars. Now, the reason why I think it's his legal predicament, that's his major motivation for supporting this overhaul, is that before he became a criminal defendant, Netanyahu actually was a strong supporter of the Supreme Court. He praised the independence and power of the Supreme Court and actually blocked legislation from his right-wing allies that was intended to weaken the court. So it's only really since he's become a criminal defendant that his attitude towards the Supreme Court and the Israeli judiciary in general has really abruptly, dramatically changed. And I think it's hard not to see this change of attitude as not somehow connected to his own legal predicament. Specifically, how would this judicial overhaul help Netanyahu get out of his legal predicament? Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, if the government were to gain control over the process of judicial appointments through this Judicial Appointments Committee, that would essentially give it and give Netanyahu's allies, therefore, control over the promotions of the judges who are currently presiding over his criminal trial. Right? So they would essentially would know that Netanyahu and his allies would control their promotions. Whether that might affect their decisions, their rules, is hard to say, but it would certainly create a cloud over their decisions. And also, the government would also have the power, as I've said, to appoint Israel's next Supreme Court justices. And I think whatever happens in Netanyahu's trial, whether he's convicted or acquitted, there's going to be an appeal and it's going to reach the Supreme Court. And if it reaches the Supreme Court, as it almost certainly will, then essentially Netanyahu and his allies would be choosing the justices who would in effect decide his fate, because they would be the justices on the Supreme Court. So that's two very specific ways in which this judicial overhaul could benefit Netanyahu legally from his current situation. But it's not just Netanyahu who's promoting this. And in many ways, Netanyahu is probably the more reluctant player of who have been promoting this. And of course, we have to remember Israel has a coalition government, so it's also important to look at the motives of his coalition partner. If we look at the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, there's a couple of motives that they have. For Shas, which is the more Mizrahi or Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, it is, in many respects driven by their desire for their leader, Aryeh Deri, to serve in the government. The Supreme Court, when he was appointed a minister, the Supreme Court ruled that he couldn't take that position because of his criminal convictions, especially his recent criminal conviction for tax evasion. He was going to serve as finance minister, by the way, which is ironic for somebody who's been convicted of tax evasion. He struck a plea deal and left the Knesset in order to avoid a prison sentence. And this was grounds for the Supreme Court to say he's not essentially fit to be a government minister. Now, Shas want this judicial overhaul to pass, because then the government would essentially be able to reinstate him, despite the Supreme Court's ruling, as a minister in the government. The other ultra-Orthodox party is the Ashkenazi-dominated United Torah Judaism Party. And for them, it's primarily about the issue that is of big concern to them and has been one of the most divisive issues in Israeli politics for many years, and that is the question of Haredi enlistment, or the enlistment of their young men in the IDF. Previously, when there were laws passed to exempt Haredim, young men, particularly from serving in the IDF, the Supreme Court struck down those laws because they are clearly discriminatory. They discriminate against Israelis who do have to serve, who do have to enlist at the age of 18. And the Haredim really want, therefore, to pass this exemption from military service and ensure that the Supreme Court cannot veto it. And so that is the primary reason that they have been supporting this judicial overhaul. But they also have broader goals insofar as they have an agenda to impose essentially religious laws on non-Israeli, on non-Haredi Israelis, on non-Haredi Jews. And that would, and in many cases, those religious laws would violate the civil rights of Israelis and therefore likely be blocked by the Supreme Court. And again, they hope, therefore, to remove the Supreme Court as a potential block against some of those kind of religious rulings. For example, what do I have in mind? Things particularly pertaining to, say, commercial activities on Jewish holidays and on the Jewish Shabbat, which previously the Supreme Court has said, the laws cannot restrict too greatly the rights of more secular Israelis. Finally, the other members of the coalition, the far-right members of the government, that is the Religious Zionism Party led by Bezalel Smotrich and the Jewish Power Party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, they are probably the strongest supporters for this judicial overhaul in the government. The far right in Israel has a long, long history of animosity toward the Supreme Court, and largely because the Supreme Court has occasionally prevented it from restricted what the Israeli government and Israeli settlers can do in the West Bank. Most famously, in 1979, the court ruled that land expropriations from Palestinians under the auspices of security reasons that land that was expropriated could not be used to build new Jewish settlements in the West Bank. And then more recently, in 2020, the court vetoed a law allowing the state to expropriate Palestinian land on which settler outposts had been built. The government wanted to legalize or authorize these settlement outposts, and the Supreme Court objected to that. So the far right has long regarded the Supreme Court as an obstacle to what it wants to do in the West Bank, especially as an obstacle to its agenda, its desire to annex most, if not all, of the West Bank, and especially if in annexing the West Bank, to deny Palestinians living there equal rights or the right to vote in Israeli elections, and maybe even expelling Palestinians who live there, at least those who resist this annexation. And so the far right wants to limit the power of the Supreme Court, which it sees correctly as an obstacle to at least Israel's formal annexation of parts of the West Bank. And lest you think this is just a pipe dream, it's worth noting that the coalition agreements that Netanyahu signed back in December with those far-right parties include an explicit intention to annex the West Bank. Now, whether the government will actually do this or not, I think there is a belief on the part of the far right that their power today in the Israeli government, their success in the last election, the most successful election they've ever had, gives them a once-in-a-lifetime, a historic opportunity to fulfill this long-time goal of annexation. And so, they are determined to push through this judicial overhaul. Okay, so that's what the government wants and why. But of course, what the government did not anticipate, I think, what has clearly taken the government by surprise has been the reaction from the Israeli public. I think the government expected that they could push through this judicial overhaul relatively quickly and easily, and obviously that has not been the case. For more than 3 months now, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets to demonstrate against this judicial overhaul in what has become the largest and now, I think, the longest protest movement in Israel's history. Never in its history has Israel seen so many protesters taking to the streets so often. I mean, 16 weeks of protests, massive protests, 100, 200,000 turning out week after week. Just last night in Tel Aviv, there was another large protest of around 100,000 or more. And so this is really, really remarkable. And what's remarkable about this protest movement isn't just its persistence, but also its scope. It's probably the broadest protest movement in Israel's history. Many protests in the past are comprised of the kind of, Israeli leftists, a shrinking number of Israeli leftists. But this protest movement has drawn from a wide array of social and professional groups, high-tech workers who are not known for their political activism, pilots, IDF reservists, doctors, lawyers, economists, teachers, even Mossad, even employees of Israel's famed Secret Service were given permission to protest. I do think the protest movement, isn't one that includes that many religious Israelis, or for that matter, that many Arab citizens of Israel. I'm happy to talk about why that is in the Q&A. It's largely comprised of more liberal, secular, educated, and middle-class Israeli Jews. But it is a very broad protest movement. What's driving this protests and the intensity behind them, as we've seen, is this belief that Israeli democracy is under attack. It's under attack by a desperate prime minister and by an extremist far-right religious government. And they fear that Israel will become essentially in a liberal democracy like Poland or Hungary. But I don't think these protests are just about defending Israeli democracy. Zippy Livni, the former justice and foreign minister, in a conference that my center, the Nazarian Center, organized, I think put it very well what was driving the protest. She said that they were battle, I know this is a quote, a battle for the soul and future of Israel, what kind of country we want to be. So I think it's not just about democracy, but for many secular Israeli Jews, it's really being perceived as a kind of existential struggle to preserve their very way of life. And that's why, as I said, so many secular Israeli Jews have been involved in this. It's been remarkable to observe this protest movement from afar, although actually the protests have also been taking place in Los Angeles and in other American cities with many expat Israelis and others joining them. It's also been quite remarkable for me to hear the criticism that's been coming from mainstream American Jewish organizations and Jewish leaders who aren't really known for vocally criticizing Israel. In fact, often they tend to scold Israel's critics. But there's really been an outpouring of vocal opposition from American Jews, and not just from, the usual candidates groups on the left and center left like J Street, but also from American Jewish leaders and organizations that typically, as I said, don't criticize Israel, like the Jewish Federations of North America, who sent an open letter to Netanyahu, criticizing this judicial overhaul. Also, people like Alan Dershowitz, Michael Bloomberg, Dov Waxman, even Trump's former ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, all have come out and publicly criticized this judicial overhaul. In fact, Dov Waxman, who, when he was director of the ADL, generally hardly ever criticized Israel, he went so far as to tell an interviewer, and I quote, "If Israel ceases to be an open democracy, I won't be able to support it." And that's, coming from somebody like Dov Waxman, a lifelong and strong, staunch supporter of Israel, I think is really quite a remarkable statement. What's driving this criticism is, I think, the fear that this overhaul will upset the very delicate balance that exists between Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. And they fear that if Israel becomes a more Jewish state and a less democratic one, that will harm US-Israel relations and alienate many, if not most, non-Orthodox American Jews, for whom Israel's democracy, Israel's democratic identity has always been one of its most attractive features. And I think that concern across much of the American Jewish establishment is, in fact, well-founded. Okay, so there's been this outpouring of criticism. There's been these unprecedented protests. It has succeeded thus far in forcing the government to pause the legislation and to enter into talks that are being hosted by President Herzog in his residence to try to reach some kind of compromise. These talks are ongoing. They really only just recently really got seriously underway. So let me just say a word about whether I think these talks could succeed or will succeed. Well, clearly, I think a compromise is possible. Many people in Israel, many experts, acknowledge the case for judicial reform, recognize that some judicial reform might not be a bad thing. But what's important is to ensure a judicial reform that leaves in place a viable system of checks and balances, right? Not to enact a judicial reform that completely removes any checks and balances on the Israeli government. There is a proposal that was made by President Herzog, which would do this, which would limit the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down certain laws. It would change the balance of power on the Judicial Appointments Committee so that just judges wouldn't have veto power on that committee. But crucially, Herzog's compromise proposal doesn't include a so-called override clause that would allow the Knesset to cancel or override Supreme Court rulings. And it doesn't give the coalition, the government, an automatic majority on the Judicial Appointments Committee. That's the kind of compromise that I think could be accepted by both sides. Whether the protesters on the streets would accept it is less clear, because some insist that there shouldn't be any judicial reform, but I think a compromise over judicial reform is possible. However, I don't expect it to happen. I think it's unlikely, primarily because of the opposition by the Justice Minister, Levin, who is really committed, along with a few other hardliners in the Likud, to a full overhaul and is not really inclined toward compromise. And also, as I said, the two far-right parties in the governing coalition who are really committed to eviscerating the Supreme Court's power and I think want to ensure this overhaul gets through. I think the Haredi parties might be more flexible. Netanyahu, I think himself, is more flexible, but this is a coalition thing, and he doesn't want to lose his governing coalition. If he were to accept a compromise, that would be unacceptable to them. So what would happen if these talks fail? Well, if the talks fail, then the government will pick up this legislation and try and pass it as quickly as possible. Some of the most contentious elements of the plan have already passed their first reading, their preliminary reading in Israel's parliament. They have to go through two more, but they could be very quickly approved once the government decides to move forward. If that happens and these laws are enacted by the Knesset, then everybody expects the Supreme Court to veto those laws, right? But, to see them as essentially unconstitutional, and that would create then a unprecedented constitutional crisis, where the laws intended to take away the Supreme Court's veto were vetoed by the Supreme Court. And then we're really into uncharted territory in terms of who would follow the government, who would follow the Supreme Court. Now, I worry that might well occur, but I also think it's also important to consider, the more optimistic scenario where the talks succeed and a compromise is reached. Let's say that happens. Let's say somehow cooler heads prevail. President Herzog is able to encourage a compromise, an agreement, a judicial reform is achieved and reached, and it's accepted by the protesters so that they end these massive protests. Would that then mean that Israeli democracy has been saved? Would the battle, in other words, for Israeli democracy have been won? Well, sadly, my answer to that is unequivocally no. I think it is essential to protect the power and independence of the Supreme Court in order, as I've said, to prevent Israel from becoming a more theocratic and less democratic state and to protect the rights of many groups. But it's simply stopping this judicial overhaul or judicial coup, as some call it, is not enough to save Israeli democracy. That's because there is an even greater threat to Israeli democracy than the judicial overhaul, and that is the occupation and ongoing annexation of the West Bank. Now, the protests in Israel that I talked about and the American Jewish criticism of the judicial overhaul really have almost completely ignored the issue of Israel's occupation of the West Bank. The protests and the criticism is all about the threat to democracy in Israel within the Green Line, as if the Green Line really still exists. It does not address Israel's military rule over millions of Palestinians in the West Bank. In fact, the word occupation is hardly uttered except by a small group of leftists in the so-called anti-occupation bloc. For the most part, the organizers of the demonstrations have gone to great pains to ensure that the occupation is not on their agenda. And those who have brought Palestinian flags to these demonstrations have actually been stopped by organizers who haven't wanted, understandably, to scare off more centrist and right-wing Israelis. While I understand that desire to keep the protest movement broad, politically as broad as possible, I do think that that it is a serious mistake to ignore the issue of the occupation and Israel's de facto annexation of the West Bank. Because if you're a campaign for Israeli democracy, a demand for Israeli democracy, really cannot, ignore the fact that Israel undemocratically rules over millions of Palestinians in the West Bank who are disenfranchised, who cannot vote for its governments. And these governments, Israeli governments, determine, almost every aspect of their lives in the West Bank. Now, of course, there is the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but the Palestinian Authority is not a Palestinian government. It's more like a glorified municipal government, and a corrupt and undemocratic one at that. But if you look at what Israel controls, if you look at the governance that Israel has over the West Bank, it controls immigration to the West Bank, population registration, imports and exports, water supply, transportation infrastructure, internet infrastructure, land use policy and planning, and has complete control over the land, sea and airspace of the West Bank. All of this really, I think, shows that Israel effectively rules over the West Bank. And that raises the question of whether Israel can even claim to be a democracy when it rules over millions of people who don't have the right to vote. And also, let's not forget, when it basically discriminates against Palestinians legally in the West Bank, because they live under military laws, whereas their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors, Israeli Jewish settlers, live under Israeli civilian laws. And that situation, that two-tiered legal structure in the West Bank is one that's been called by many human rights organizations to constitute the crime of apartheid. We're happy to discuss that issue in the Q&A, but whether we want to call it apartheid or not, it's clearly undemocratic. And I think, sadly, that this rule which is now been going on for 56 years, it can no longer be regarded as temporary. It can no longer be seen as just a temporary phenomenon that's about to end with a two-state solution. Rather, it has become, tragically, in my opinion, a permanent state of affairs. There's no serious expectation that this rule is going to end anytime soon. And therefore, the West Bank has to be seen now as not outside of Israel, but rather as part of Israel. And let's not forget, of course, that nearly 500,000 Israeli Jewish settlers live in the West Bank. And if you include East Jerusalem within that, actually that's 750,000 Israelis. Really, you know, too many that are likely to ever be evacuated. So there is, as many analysts and scholars have now acknowledged, a one-state reality. What they call a one-state reality between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this one-state reality is not the same as a one-state solution. Many people confuse the two ideas. It's very, very, very far from being a one-state solution. It is a one-state reality in that, insofar as there is one state that effectively governs this entire area. And this government, as I said, this governance is fundamentally undemocratic insofar as millions of people living under its rule have no right to vote. So what does this mean then for Israeli democracy? Well, it means that really to save Israeli democracy or fully restore Israeli democracy, it's not just, as I said, enough to stop the judicial overhaul. Ultimately, that Israel must either allow Palestinians to achieve independent statehood, which would, as I said, mean essentially succession from this one-state reality, or grant Palestinians equal rights within this one state. That includes the right to vote. Now, personally, I much prefer the former option. I have been a long-time supporter of a two-state solution. I would prefer Palestinians to have their own independent state alongside Israel, because I want Israel to maintain its predominantly Jewish character. But I can't, but much as I want Israel to maintain its predominantly Jewish character, that I can't accept that being an undemocratic Jewish state. I can't accept it being an undemocratic Jewish state. And I think I'm not alone in this. In fact, I think most American Jews who are most non-Orthodox American Jews who are liberal, and in fact, most Americans in general, I think, will ultimately prioritize, if forced to choose, Israel's democracy over its Jewish character. And in fact, in surveys, at least among Americans, they have indicated a preference for Israel's democracy over its Jewish character. So I think in the years to come, therefore, not just in the next few weeks and months, we'll be focusing on this judicial overhaul, but in the longer term, over the months and years to come, the battle for Israeli democracy has to expand, has to be enlarged from the current effort, which is a narrow effort, an important effort, but a narrow effort to defend the Supreme Court, has to expand to be a broader effort to either persuade Israelis to withdraw from much of the West Bank and accept a sovereign Palestinian state there and in the Gaza Strip, or else to give citizenship and equal rights to Palestinians living in those territories. This, I think, is going to be a long-term effort. This is not going to happen anytime soon. Israelis have very understandable fears about withdrawing from the West Bank in the near term, and will also likely strongly resist the idea of equal rights for Palestinians in the West Bank, let alone in the Gaza Strip. So I think we're talking about a years-long, even a decades-long process, a battle, if you will. So the battle for Israeli democracy in that respect is just beginning. It's just beginning. It's going to be a long-term battle. Now, let me end by saying what I think this means for Jewish Americans. I think and specifically for people who are more liberal, for the non-Orthodox American Jews, for whom, as I said, Israeli democracy, Israel's democratic identity is essential. to their support. In this battle, it is, I think, very important for American Jews not to abandon Israel, not to walk away in disgust or embarrassment or despair because of the situation that they perceive, but rather to do what their right-wing American Jewish counterparts have already been doing for quite some time, supporting their counterparts in Israel. So liberal Jews in America and elsewhere in the Jewish diaspora really need to support their liberal counterparts in Israel, both Jewish and Palestinian. They need to work they need to support them and not abandon Israel, but they need to recognize and accept that this is, as I said, a long-term battle. But to win this battle, I think liberals in Israel need our support. Finally, I think we should also bear in mind that the battle for Israeli democracy, as I've described it, is in many respects part of a larger global battle for democracy that we will be fighting in the years and maybe decades to come. This battle is not just a battle that's taking place in Israel, it's also been taking place and will continue to take place in the United States itself. And so for those reasons as well, American Jews can't sit on the sidelines. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waxman, for a wonderful beginning to this conversation. So really, really informative and wide-ranging. And I'm also noticing that we have a number of great questions in the chat. And I'll say, if these are all the questions we get, Dayenu, but if people have more questions about either the content of Dr. Waxman's talk or other questions on more general topics that you'd like to ask Dr. Waxman, go ahead and put those in the chat. We will get to as many as we can. Just because we're getting so many great questions, I may limit it to one of the questions per questioner, but we'll use our best judgment there, and we'll let Dr. Waxman take a drink there. So I think we're going to get started in just a moment. Once again, if you have a question that you have not yet put in the chat, please put it in the chat. We're only doing questions via chat. And just to keep things, just to keep the sound working well on the recording. And I think we will start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Question from Carl. Does the majority coalition actually represent the majority of Israeli voters? Or maybe I'll say, instead of asking the binary, how does the majority coalition represent the majority of Israeli voters, let alone the entire public?
Yeah, great question. Actually, it doesn't. If you look at the percentage of the popular vote that the governing coalition received, it was less than 50% of the vote. So it does not have a majority support among the Israeli voters. The reason it was able to achieve a majority in the Knesset, 64 Knesset seats, is not because it received such a large decisive win among Israeli voters, but rather because of the peculiarities, if you like, of Israel's electoral system, which essentially has a threshold that parties have to cross 3.5%. So small parties that don't reach that electoral threshold don't enter the parliament. Sometimes those have been right-wing parties. In the last election, it was the Meretz party, which fell under the threshold, as well as the Balad party, Arab political party. And so with their votes essentially lost, because those parties didn't enter the Knesset, that then benefited the electoral arithmetic for the government. And that's why they got 64 Knesset seats, even though I think they only received about 48.9% or something of the popular vote. Only like a few thousand votes more than the opposition. So they don't have a majority of the Israeli public, not to mention, when we talk about majorities here, if you think about demographically, if you accept what I was saying about this one state reality, right? That means, in other words, that there is a single state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. then actually many demographers would say that Palestinians are probably a slight majority in this total area. So there's also, in that sense, even among just Israeli voters, the government would have even less majority support.
Excellent, thank you. Now, I heard you say during your talk that the organizers of the current protests have been very conscientious about separating, let's say, the issue of judicial reform from conditions affecting Palestinians. And yet we got a great question from Peter here. What is the relationship between the massive demonstrations protesting Netanyahu's judicial proposals and the reality that Palestinians live with in the West Bank?
What is that? Well, so as I said, I think in terms of the motivations for this judicial reform, a major part of it on the right, as I outlined, there are a variety of motivations, but a major part of it is because of the Supreme Court's, the Supreme Court has occasionally blocked what Israeli government and particularly Israeli Jewish settlers want to do in the West Bank. So you cannot understand what's behind this judicial overhaul without recognizing how it's deeply connected to the occupation and the ongoing annexation of the West Bank. As I said, because it's really for the Israeli right, it's because of a large part of their antipathy towards the Supreme Court is because the Supreme Court has occasionally, not that often, but occasionally blocked the Israeli government from doing certain things in the West Bank, and even more that they believe correctly that the Supreme Court might prevent them from doing the things that they want to do in the future. So this is not just an issue that only concerns Israeli citizens. This is an issue that has a direct and will have a very immediate impact upon Israel's non-citizens, Palestinians in the West Bank, not only because it could facilitate the intensification of the annexation of the West Bank and settlement building, expansion, etc., but also because it would, as I said, take away whatever protection the Supreme Court has previously given to Palestinians in the West Bank. So these are two issues that are intimately connected. And that's why, although politically I understand why the protest movement didn't want to deal with the occupation and wanted to be a big tent movement and to bring in, and they've succeeded in bringing in some right-wing Israelis, but at the expense analytically and ultimately strategically in the long term of ignoring the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's the protests are not quote unquote about the West Bank, but the outcome of the protests have a very real impact on that situation unfolding.
Yeah.
So I want to acknowledge that part of the reasons we scheduled this talk where we did is that we're approaching the observance of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut beginning, I believe, tomorrow night. And so one of our community Chazanim, Cantor Aviva Rosenberg, asked, how will this terrible situation affect our observance of Yom HaAtzmaut this year? I mean, this is a time of traditional public demonstrations of various kinds, religious, historical, nationalistic. This is when people come out in public for this particular occasion. How will Israelis be meeting this moment with the protests as well? Yeah,
I mean, so let me focus on two elements of this. First of all, what it means for Israeli Jews, particularly observing Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and also what it means for us over here or everybody in the Jewish diaspora. So for Israeli Jews, I think these days are typically days of national unity, of coming together, of first of all mourning the losses through the wars and terrorist attacks, something that has touched tragically, most Israeli Jews one way or the other. And so Yom HaZikaron, and then, immediately switching to Yom HaTzmaut with this moment of great celebration and parties and festivities, those events, which have always been a time for Israelis to come together, is just not the case today. Remarkably, Yair Lapid, the leading the head of the opposition, is at least as far as I know at the moment, planning to boycott the memorial ceremony, the torch lighting ceremony on Mount Herzl, which takes place every year. I mean, that is really quite something. And there are real worries that there's going to be protests during that ceremony, such that I think they're planning to cut off the broadcast and show recordings in case it's disrupted. This is remarkable. This indicates how deeply divisive the situation is today. The fact that Israelis, patriotic, these are people who would boycott, who would protest this, they are patriotic Israelis. They're not, people who would otherwise boycott or protest a Memorial Day ceremony. The fact that this is a possibility and maybe even a likelihood, I think really conveys how serious the situation this is, how deeply divisive this has become, and how strongly the protesters feel about this judicial overhaul. For us here, this is also, I think, a difficult Yom HaTzmaut. I mean, on the one hand, it should be a celebratory one, Israel reaching 75 years, which is, a huge achievement. I mean, if you think of everything that the country has undergone over the many years, if you think of it in this fullness of time. But sadly, I think for many American Jews, this is a very, bittersweet occasion, precisely because the Israel that they see today is not the Israel that they love and that they've been attached to. And there's deep sense, I think, of foreboding among many, at least liberal and non-Orthodox American Jews, about where Israel's heading and what it means for their own relationship with Israel. So I think it's important to observe these events. My own center is observing these events, but no, I use the word observe rather than kind of celebrate, because I don't think people are in a mood for celebration right now. I think we need to take stock. We should, as Jews, take pride in Israel's many accomplishments and achievements, and in the existence of the state. But at the same time, I don't think we should delude ourselves about the challenges and the problems it has.
I understand. Thank you. Now I have a question that has been on my mind for a long time now. What's your sense of how close are we to? Well, the question is from Carol: is will a constitution be written soon?
I think I can pretty safely answer that with a one-word no. I mean, yes, there's been some speculation and suggestions that now would be a good time. I mean, if it hasn't been reached over 74 odd years, or 75 actually, because there was the attempt to do it even before Israel came into being, I don't see any likelihood now. I mean, Israel was supposed to, when UN Resolution 181 was passed by the United Nations General Assembly in November of 1947, there was the requirement that the new Jewish state, once established, would quickly pass a constitution. And Israel did set up a constitutional assembly, which ultimately became the first Knesset, with the intention of doing that. And there was even a constitution drafted by an eminent legal scholar, Hans Kohn. That did not ever happen. That constitution went nowhere, for very good reasons, because there was back then, fundamental disagreement about the nature of the state, right? And in particular about the relationship between religion, between Judaism and the state. Those disagreements have not disappeared. If anything, they've only deepened over the years. And the ultra-Orthodox in particular is more powerful today, much larger today than it was back in 1948. So if it was difficult to reach an agreement, a constitution in 1948, 1949, I don't see any reason why it would be easier to do so today. And that's why, instead of a constitution, there is these series of basic laws. Now, you could bring them maybe together under one kind of package. And I think it would be good, for example, to pass a basic law on the judiciary that would really, spell out the powers of the Supreme Court. But I don't see much prospect for a constitution to be achieved in the near term.
Thank you. Now, are there, let's see, Debbie is asking, are there organizations here, presumably in the United States, that you recommend for us to support, that you recommend for us to consider if we want to support democracy in Israel?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are. I think, first of all, picking an organization that is willing to acknowledge and confront the challenges. And so that's the first thing. Like, is there an honest recognition of the challenges? And that means not just talking about the judicial overhaul, it means also talking about the occupation, annexation of the West Bank. Sadly, many organizations which do lots of good work in Israel and in the United States aren't willing to do that, aren't willing to be honest about the real serious problems. So I think we need to demand that from organizations that we support. And I think I don't think all of them need to be, vocally protesting all the time, but I do think they need to be willing to be outspoken when necessary. And so organizations that haven't been outspoken, that in fact are willing to put up with whatever Israel does and whatever the Israeli government does, no matter how undemocratic, I don't think those reflect American Jewish values, or at least the values of the American Jewish majority. So to call out organizations by name, I think that means AIPAC, because AIPAC, although I understand AIPAC's mission is to preserve the US-Israel relationship and not a broader Israel advocacy type thing, AIPAC has, I think, really, not risen to the moment in its refusal to take any public position on the, or even privately, as far as I know, on the judicial overhaul. Whereas I think like J Street, by contrast, has been willing to do that. And I think that's important. I also think an organization like the New Israel Fund is an important organization to support many groups in Israel, who, as I said, liberal Israelis and many groups in Israel that are working to advance democracy in Israel and improve both human rights and civil rights for all Israelis. But there are many others as well. I mean, those are just two, but there are many others on a whole host of issues. And as I say, American Jews on the right, conservative American Jews, haven't been shy about supporting their preferred causes. Think about the important role that the Kohelet Policy Forum, for example, which is funded largely by American Jews, has played in promoting this judicial overhaul. So liberal Jews need to do the same, and they need to invest and they need to support their liberal counterparts in Israel.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. When we have a scholar of Dr. Waxman's caliber here, I prefer to go from the binary yes or no questions to the how can we, or what are the considerations. And I really like that you phrase that in terms of, here are the criteria for looking for organizations that that support what you support. What I want to, I think what I'm going to conclude with today is this particular question that we've been studying a lot. We have an adult education class going right now from the Melton School of Adult Learning that's been giving a great overview of the history of Israel from Zionist beginnings into the formation of the state, into the demographic challenges in the 50s, and into the burgeoning religious diversity and the challenges that come with that. And the question comes up again, almost maybe falsely couching it in the binary. Do we are we looking for Israel to be a Jewish state or a democratic state? And Ellen asks, why should it be a binary? And she says, a Jewish state versus a democratic state, isn't Judaism inherently carrying toward, quote unquote, the other? Can't we support a democratic state by supporting a Jewish state? Would you think a Jewish state could easily include equal rights for all? And I know that that was explicitly in the language of the Declaration of Independence. So is that too much to dream for?
No, I mean, I personally, that's long been my own position. I believe that Israel, can be a Jewish state and a democracy. I think Judaism has multiple values, and I don't think we can just say it only is the liberal universalist streams of Judaism. There are other streams of Judaism, there are other strains within the Jewish tradition which are deeply illiberal. But I do think it's possible for Israel to have a Jewish character, to be a kind of Jewish state that doesn't that is a democracy, that doesn't discriminate against its non-Jewish citizens, for example. And that's why, I and many American Jews, I think most American Jews wanted a two-state solution, because that was the way that Israel could be indeed a Jewish state and a democracy, by allowing Palestinians to have their own statehood alongside Israel on the West Bank and Gaza. That would ensure most likely a Jewish majority in Israel, and therefore that Israel could retain its Jewish character. What I'm saying is, the situation today is that many, if not most, of the people under Israeli rule, Palestinians, don't have the right to vote. That is not democratic. So at the moment we have a Jewish state, but not really a democracy. And in order for it to be a Jewish state and democracy, there either needs to be, the only way for that really to happen is either to allow for Palestinian statehood. Now, I ultimately think that should be a kind of confederal system, which could allow both Jews and Palestinians to exercise their rights to national self-determination. I think Jews have a right to self-determination in their land of Israel, and that Palestinians have a right to self-determination in their land of Palestine. It happens to be the same land. So we have to figure out a way that both can exercise self-determination, and I think both have a right and should live in democracies. So yes, it's possible, but we need to, but in order to get there, we have to first of all confront the facts on the ground today.
Thank you. And I said we were going to end with that one, but we're getting all sorts of questions coming in under the wire. So I want to honor the curiosities that people have while we have you here. There was somebody who asked about, what about the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation? I believe you just touched on that. Am I correct?
Yes. And
can you say more about what that looks like?
Yeah. So, one of the options, this is somewhat of a distant prospect, I must acknowledge, but it's one that I personally think is the most viable now in the long run, is for there to be two states, Israel and a Palestinian state, but with ultimately with a great deal of power sharing between them, and eventually open borders, and allowing Israeli Jews, citizens of Israel, to live in a Palestinian state, and citizens of a Palestinian state to live in Israel, or at least to work there. Something along the lines of the European Union. In other words, where you still have states, you have independent states like France and Germany, right? They still have control over, they still have their own sovereignty, but on many day-to-day matters of governance, they share power, they have a common economic union, and free movement, trade, etc. within their borders. I think ultimately that is the best way of allowing both sides to achieve their national aspirations for self-determination, while recognizing that the populations within Israel-Palestine are effectively now too intermingled and too interdependent to just separate into two states as traditionally conceived. So to my mind, that a confederation is a more realistic solution than either a binational state, a one-state solution, or the two-state solution, which is that the two-state solution I personally have long supported. But I don't think that traditional two-state solution, which would necessitate a large removal of Israeli settlers from the West Bank, I don't think that's likely to happen, unfortunately.
Excellent, thank you. I want to ask a question that came in from Narit. Narit says, would like to better understand the deeper reasons for the right's animus toward the Supreme Court, rooted in Chief Justice Aharon Barak's judicial revolution of 1992. And I believe you touched on that early in your talk, but could you say more about that?
Yeah, so from the Israeli rights point of view, that constitutional revolution, which is said is essentially the Supreme Court taking on the power of judicial review of the Knesset legislation. That's something that started in the mid-1990s under Aharon Barak, where the Supreme Court started to say, okay, if the Knesset passes laws that violate Israel's basic laws, we have the ability to void that legislation, to veto it, essentially. And that wasn't something that the Supreme Court had done previously. So this is a new power. And it was a power that therefore those on the right believe is somehow illegitimate, because it's something that dates back to the 1990s. But really what they object to isn't simply the power, but the fact that it is a kind of liberal activism, that they see the Supreme Court as essentially an attempt by a declining, shrinking liberal elite to use this power of judicial review to stymie the wishes of the Jewish majority, to stymie the wishes of most Israeli Jews who are on the right, from doing what they want. So they see the court. And it's not, this perception isn't entirely false, that the court has made many important rulings, liberal rulings. It has voided, it has become more activist, although it's not as liberal or quite as activist as it's somehow depicted to be. The right see the court as a bastion of liberalism, an elite bastion, because these are, judges, a closed club, and that it has repeatedly blocked laws passed by elected governments, and therefore is not democratic.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I want to go back and consider and ask you, this is a question from Carl. I think given everybody who's asked a question, at least one. And so when I ask another question from Carl, and as soon as I say that, I lose it in the chat. Here we go. If you could please comment on international consequences of this anti-democratic movement in Israel, and including maybe U.S.'s support and Saudi interests as well. Well, what are the international consequences of what's going on right now?
So of the consequences specifically on the judicial overhaul, so far, they've been fairly limited. As I say, it's mostly reverberated across the Jewish diaspora and within Israel. It has had an impact on US-Israel relations, because the Biden administration are clearly unhappy with this judicial overhaul. They oppose this judicial overhaul. President Biden himself has campaigned on, protecting democracy, and this idea of the world being divided between democracies and autocracies. And so Israel kind of sliding into becoming a liberal democracy is something that conflicts in many ways with the Biden administration's more global agenda. And I think initially they voiced that displeasure privately as their preference. But as that didn't have any impact, President Biden in the end did make some quite blunt public remarks about his, hoping that the Israeli government would essentially stop this process and find a compromise. The US Ambassador Knights has also made those comments. So I'm sure this is not something that the Biden administration are happy about. And it is a headache for them, because they don't want to deal with Israel. I mean, they have other issues on their plate, needless to say. You know, the war just on the foreign policy front, obviously we've got Ukraine and Russia and China and a whole lot. So this is really, they really don't want to have deal with the headaches from the Israel or from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That said, I don't think there's going to be a kind of rupture in the relationship between the US and Israel over this, because the Biden administration has shown itself clearly to be unwilling to really, have a confrontation with Israel, with at least or with Netanyahu, and I think for understandable political reasons that President Biden's about to seek re-election, and he knows he's learned from the experience of his predecessor Barack Obama that it's generally not a good idea to pick a fight with Netanyahu, and the Republicans are staunchly supportive of Netanyahu and the Israeli government. So I don't think there's going to be some major rupture, but I think what we are seeing, and the overhaul really intensifies this process, is a gradual shift of attitudes on Capitol Hill and in the White House toward Israel among Democrats, whereby essentially you've got this growing divide now, a partisan divide, where Republicans are standing by Israel, right or wrong, as they see it, and are quite have no problem with Israel being undemocratic. They will basically stand by Israel, and they will not criticize it. Whereas Democrats, for whom those shared values are apparently more important, are increasingly uncomfortable with the direction Israel is heading, increasingly vocal in their criticisms of Israel, increasingly sympathetic toward the Palestinians. Most Democratic voters now expressing equal levels of sympathy toward Israelis and Palestinians. So the bipartisan consensus that long prevailed in Washington with regards to Israel is gone. And it's not just because of this judicial overhaul. There are many reasons that have been pushing this, but we see it on this. So it has had an impact. It's furthering the judicial overhaul, and the debate about is furthering that process in Washington. And more generally, that perception that Israel does not have the same shared values as the United States when it comes to democracy and liberalism. Although, as I said, actually, not all Americans have those values either. So the way I see it, it's not Israel on one side, the United States on another, democratic, the US versus illiberal Israel. Rather, as I mentioned at the end of my lecture, the battle for democracy runs within the United States and within Israel today and across the world. And that is the battle. It's inside the United States and it's inside Israel. It's not between Israel and the United States.
Thank you. And when we talk about Israel in some of my classes, and not just our advanced adult learners, but also even in the Introduction to Judaism class, where many people are wrestling with understanding for the first time. I don't know if this is an apt comparison, but I also say, take a look at where the United States was when it was 75 years old.
Right, exactly.
We were on the verge of the Civil War, which is concerning, and we're still here, which is for me.
Exactly. No, I think that historical perspective is really important. It's one of the when I teach about Israel to my students, it's largely history, because it's important to understand both how relatively young Israel is as a country, how relatively immature its democracy is in that respect. I mean, the United States couldn't really be considered a liberal democracy by contemporary standards throughout most of its history, until really the last few decades, and even then it's still struggling. And right now we see attempts to subvert American democracy. So if you look at this in historical perspective, first of all, it's remarkable that Israel has maintained its democracy in many ways and achieved a democracy, but it also leads us, I think, to acknowledge that the process of democratization isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over decades and decades and has to be continually fought for. And is always in danger of being reversed.
So I want to ask one final question, and this wasn't in the chat because it's just been on my mind. Especially early in the protests and as they were heating up, I often heard the comment, well, this show of division amongst Israelis, it poses a security threat for Israel, right? It's this division, this protest, this is a distraction, and it's going to make Israel weak to the countries that would take advantage of that. And so I'm curious as to your response to that. Like, for me, part of it feels specious and political, part of it feels very, very real. And so I'd like you to comment on that, and then we're going
I think there's some, I mean, when we say countries, I think we should be more specific, say country, Iran, because, you know, Israel actually has had good relations with quite a few states now in the Middle East. It's really Iran and its support for, you know, Hezbollah and Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I don't think that there's a reason to not protest. I think there's a reason to not push through the judicial overhaul, because if you're serious about Israeli security, then, you know, doing something that's so deeply divisive and that's led to such massive protests within the Israeli military, among IDF reservists and among pilots, you know, means that if Israeli security is your concern, then don't do something that's going to lead many Israeli, patriotic Israeli soldiers and pilots who are now saying they won't serve or they won't perform their reserve service. And you know, this is the reason why Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, you know, came out against the judicial overhaul, because he saw and he heard the impact it was having within the ranks of the IDF on IDF's military readiness. And there are specific reasons why pilots, for example, and soldiers have concerns about the judicial overhaul, because they worry that it might lead them to being indicted in international criminal courts. If the Israeli judiciary is not seen as independent, it could lead to prosecutions of Israeli soldiers and officers and policymakers. So there's a specific concern that they have. But it has undoubtedly had a serious impact upon the IDF. And that impact is a real concern, because yes, Israel's enemies, especially in Tehran, are watching, and in Beirut. And in fact, you know, there's intelligence suggests that they have wanted to exploit this situation and take advantage of it. They do see Israel as dangerous, as divided and as weaker than it has been in the past, and they want to exploit that. So that is a real worry. It means why it's one reason why the risk of miscalculation and conflict, whether between Israel and Hezbollah or Israel and Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and even Israel and Iran, is higher today than it has been before. And I'm worried about that. But I think we should be clear that that's the protesters, the people, or the demonstrations, that they're not put to blame for that. They're responding to this overhaul, which is, you know, not is being deeply divisive. So I think it's another reason why the government should stop this and actually focus on restoring it some unity, precisely because if for no other reason, I mean, there are many other reasons, but one being that Israel does face a real serious security threat from Iran and its allies.
Thank you, Dr. Waxman. We're going to have to conclude here as we're getting to the top of the hour. But before we do, I not only wish to thank you for really bringing it today. Thank you for debuting this talk with us and answering all these wonderful questions earnestly. I tried to get at least one question from each questioner in here. And but before we conclude, I want to thank our friends Judy Callahan and Peter Braun, who are the boots on the ground to help us with the sponsorship of the Adult Education Committee, as well as the Social Justice Committee here at PJTC, in putting this event together in association with the national organization J Street. Grateful to them as well for making this possible. And so we're going to go ahead and sign off on it for right now. But last thank you to all the wonderful participants that we had today. So many people signed up, showed up, and really brought your hearts, brought great questions, and really did us an honor in demonstrating what a concerned community we are. And once again, thank you, Professor Waxman, for informing us and engaging us. And I wish everybody a holy occasion of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut coming up tomorrow night at sundown. Thanks, everybody. And for now, this is Rabbi John Carrier on behalf of PJTC saying shalom.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Dr. Waxman, I just wanted to say thank you. It was a wonderful and very informative and thought-provoking presentation.